ha realizado algunos estragos en términos de la participación de la gente, pero esperemos que en la medida en que se vaya desarrollando la presentación, vayamos llenando los asientos vacíos. Bueno, queríamos coronar con broche de oro el ciclo de las 3 conferencias plenarias contempladas en este evento, y para hacerlo, qué mejor que contar con nosotros a uno de los autores e intelectuales más connotados y reconocidos en el campo del diseño organizacional y la administración pública, como es el profesor Barry Bozeman. El profesor Bozeman hará su presentación sobre causas, efectos y efectividad de la burocratización en naciones cuya administración pública está en proceso de desarrollo, reformas sensitivas al desarrollo referidas a culturas políticas únicas o específicas o particularizadas. El profesor Bozeman obviamente tiene un currículum demasiado largo para leer, y lo que nos interesa es escuchar lo que él nos tiene por decir. Entonces me voy a detener en lo más significativo. Tiene un doctorado en Administración Pública, es actualmente profesor de Gestión Pública y Política Tecnológica en la Universidad Estatal de Arizona. Ha sido en el pasado profesor de Políticas Públicas en la Universidad de Georgia, en el Instituto Tecnológico de Georgia y en el Maxwell School of Citizenship, una muy prestigiosa escuela de administración pública en Syracuse, estado de Nueva York. Ha sido también profesor e investigador invitado en las universidades de Michigan, de Colombia, de Copenhague, en Dinamarca, y Marne-Laval en París, en Francia. Autor de 16 libros, el más reciente, Rules and Red Tape, Reglas y Burocracia, un prisma para el desarrollo de la teoría de la administración pública, otras obras muy conocidas que seguramente ustedes en algún momento de su carrera han tenido la oportunidad de revisar y conocer. Sus artículos han aparecido en los diarios y publicaciones periódicas más importantes de los Estados Unidos, para nombrar unas pocas: el American Journal of Political Science, el Wall Street Journal, el Economist, New York Times, etc. Ha participado en una serie como asesor de instituciones como la National Science Foundation, el Servicio de Impuestos Internos de los Estados Unidos, el Departamento de Comercio, el Departamento de Energía, y pare usted contar. Ayudó en el diseño y evaluación de los sistemas nacionales de innovación en la República de Sudáfrica, en Canadá, en Nueva Zelanda, en Francia, en Israel, en Chile y en Argentina. Estamos de verdad frente a una autoridad de primer orden en esta materia, y por lo tanto me da mucho placer y tenemos el honor y el orgullo de contarlo hoy día con nosotros. Los dejo con el profesor Bozeman. Adelante, profesor. Gracias. You can talk from the podium.
Buenos dias. I think I'm going to start with a story that just occurred to me. This is not a story about bureaucracy. It's a story about me. Several years ago, I had the pleasure of being installed as an honorary professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And I was amazed at what a really nice, formal installation they had prepared for me. They had a choir. I'd never had a choir in my honor. They also had a beautiful flower arrangement. You can see why I'm reminded of this story. And so knowing that this is such an important ceremonial event, I spent a good deal of time preparing for it. And I thought I had a nice speech. I spent time on it. I liked it. I was prepared to give it. I thought it would be interesting for the people who were there. And I got through maybe 3 or 4 words, maybe 3 or 4 sentences, I guess. And because of the beautiful flower arrangements, I had a coughing fit that would not allow me to say anything for the next hour or so. And so my wonderful speech that I'd rehearsed that was in my honor was canceled because of the flower arrangement. But today we don't have that problem because I'm not allergic to these flowers, or at least they're far enough away. So I think I'm going to be able to get through this talk. I'd like to start the talk by thanking my host, CLAD, for their very gracious invitation. And I'd also like to thank you for taking your busy day on a Friday. I guess this is the last day of the conference, and spending time with me. I appreciate that. And most of all, I would like to thank my translators, because I have been told in the past that I may be one of the more difficult people to translate that they've ever worked with. And so I expect I'll be hearing más despacio, but I'm going to try to hold myself from my usual talking binge and talk more slowly and deliberately as you deserve and as they do. What I'm talking about today is the topic of bureaucratization. One of the things that I think I can count on is when I talk about this topic, people will agree with one part of it, and that is that everybody's in favor of good government. Everybody's in favor of effective government. So I don't expect to create a huge amount of controversy in that domain. However, there may be some other parts in which we'll have a little bit more controversy where you will be able to basically find the talk less enervating than you might otherwise find it. Now I'm going to have a technological experience and see if this works easily and well. Yes, yeah. Well, it did. That's good. Okay. So I'm going to focus here on 3 questions. I think sometimes the simple questions are sometimes the most difficult questions, and these are the questions. First, how much public bureaucracy is enough, and how do we optimize the size of the bureaucracy? And here I'm talking about the public bureaucracy. Secondly, what are the normative models? What are the values we want to focus on in bureaucracy, and how do we choose the appropriate normative model for bureaucracy? Not just how much is enough, but what should it be? It may seem odd that we would even be asking these questions in this day and age, but of course these questions do not have consensus answers. The third question is, what are the ends of bureaucracy, and specifically how can public values-based bureaucracy be achieved? And I will suggest that it's much more difficult to achieve public values goals than it is even to achieve efficiency goals, and I'm not at all unmindful of how difficult it is to achieve efficiency goals. So that's the talk. Let's start with one important definition to kind of get us off on the right foot here, since I don't have the same view that a lot of American politicians do about bureaucracy. So what I mean by bureaucratization is the deployment of the institution of bureaucracy and its characteristic components as a means of social organization of work. So what that implies, of course, is that bureaucracy is not inherently good, it's not inherently bad. It is not something that we can achieve without limit. It is not something that we should work to diminish necessarily. Rather, it is an approach to addressing social problems. It's not the only approach, and thus the question is how to use the social institution of bureaucracy effectively to achieve the goals we wish to achieve. So let's start with the first big question. How much public bureaucracy is enough, and how do we optimize the size of bureaucracy? Well, it turns out that a lot of people have been working on this problem for a long time, particularly in economics and in public administration. And as a result of that work, and I've been contributing to that literature, as have hundreds of other people, I can tell you that there's not an easy answer to this question. One reason is that there's a great deal of variance in nations' level of bureaucratization, the extensiveness of public employment, and some of the nations that are quite successful have a relatively high level of bureaucratization, and other ones do not. They're successful nations at each end of the spectrum. So we cannot generalize and say the route to economic growth and social well-being is any particular level of bureaucratization. So, for example, I know it's difficult to read some of these countries. It's the best I could do with this particular chart. For example, if we look at the government employees as a percentage of total employment for many nations, then we find at opposite ends of the scale, Republic of South Korea has 5%, which is one of the lowest levels of any nation, and Norway has 30%, which is one of the highest levels. And in fact, both of those nations are doing quite well in many respects. From an economic standpoint, they're largely equivalent. From a social well-being standpoint, they're both doing quite well. Similarly, there's a great deal of variance in Latin America. Chile, for example, the recent figures at 9.6% percentage of total employment as public employees. Brazil, 8.6%. But there's also a wide range in Latin America as well. So here are some musings that I have about size of government after working in the field for some time and reading a good deal of the literature on public administration. First of all, there is some correlation, and that is the highest income governments have the larger percentages of government employees. In the case of the United States, public employment has been stable for decades, hovering around 9 to 10% for the past 4 decades. Now, what's interesting about this, if you were a person following the news coming out of the United States, particularly the political news, then you'd have the impression that there's a great swing in public employment and the size of bureaucracy according to who happens to be in power at the time, what political party. In fact, that's not really the case. In spite of the fact that most parties seem to spend a great deal of time and energy talking about how they're going to cut back government, how they're going to make it smaller, the fact of the matter is government levels stay pretty much the same. There are some shifts. So, for example, when the federal employment lines are cut, then sometimes there's more employees in state and regional government. But in fact, it's been relatively stable. And I would argue that that stability itself has largely been a positive force, even if the political rhetoric has not been so much of a positive force. If we look at public sector employment and public enterprise employment as a percentage of total employment, then what we see is that the highest income governments have larger percentages of government employees. So it's not all about low production ratios. It's not all about new public management cutbacks. In fact, it seems to be the case that constantly cutting government is not any sort of magic elixir, no winning formula for making government effective and countries prosperous. So what I'd like to suggest is some of the contingency factors that are related to government size. So we said in the beginning there is no single optimal size of government. It depends. But what it depends on is not always that obvious or that clear-cut or, unfortunately, that controllable. But it seems that, according to research that's been occurring for some time, these are some of the factors that one would take into consideration in trying to decide an optimal size of the government. First of all, what is the role of public employment in managing the economy? In some cases, public employment is a very central means of reducing unemployment in a country, and it's in recognition of the fact that the private sector is not as vital as it might otherwise be. In other cases, that's not true at all. In other cases, the private sector is vital, and the government does not play that sort of employer of last resort role. Another issue is, what is the traditional view of government as a positive or negative force for social change? Now, that's something I think we actually don't pay enough attention to as a factor in the effectiveness of economies and in the effectiveness of governance. We do know, and again, I think we're particularly sensitive to this in the United States, that many people do not feel that government is a positive force for social change in the United States. But we also know in other countries that people have very different views. So I mentioned briefly my little anecdote about not finishing my speech when I was appointed a professor in Denmark. Well, as it turns out, they forgave me, and I visited Denmark on a regular basis for about 10 years, every year after that. And it was almost like it was the mirror image of the United States. In Denmark, people assumed, well, of course, government has a positive role to play. Why would we have a government if it was not going to be a force for social good? The number of people who supported government actions in Denmark has historically has completely eclipsed those in the United States. So countries do vary with respect to the citizen support of the role of government. And in some cases, that's actually related very closely to the foundations of the government. So if you look, for example, at the foundations of Denmark or many of the Scandinavian countries, they have long histories of homogeneous people living together and identifying with one another, whereas in the United States, we have a long history of successive waves of immigration, success and a high degree of heterogeneity among the population. And we also, it's not unimportant, have a country that was founded on protest against government. So it is not at all odd that people in the United States would have a negative view about the role of government as a force for social change. It's not new with recent Tea Parties, as we call them, Tea Party advocates. It's not new with recent changes in the conservatism of the Republican Party. It goes back many, many, many decades and is embedded in our political culture. It's not embedded in the political culture of Denmark, Sweden, or France, or many other places. Another contingency factor in trying to decide what would be an appropriate size for government is the desired role of the military and the de facto role of the military as well. So it's difficult to compare, say, the United States and, let's say Belgium, when in the fact the United States has a huge role in the world with their military. Most people in the United States are on board with their having a significant role. There's controversy about how large a role, but and most people in Belgium are probably pretty happy that they don't spend 20% of their expenditures for government on the military. So that's also an issue. That's one of the reasons there's been some back and forth between the United States and Japan for many years, is because it was argued in the 70s and 80s that Japan had a competitiveness advantage because the United States basically provided a military shield for them, and their Defense Department expenditures were very modest, whereas ours were substantial. But all of that comes out in the wash when we're thinking about the optimal size of government. What's the role of the military? What do we want the role of the military to be? A significant issue, of course, and again, there's high variety here, is what's the effectiveness of the bureaucracy? And an important part of that, not the only part by any means, is what is the level of corruption? It's not true that all uncorrupt governments are ineffective, but it is generally a good proposition that all corrupt governments are ineffective. And we also know that there's a huge amount of variance in the level of corruption because in the past few decades we've come up with a number of indices of government corruption, and in almost every case the countries at the top of the socioeconomic scale and the quality of life and the citizen satisfaction end of the scale also are in the top of the scale in terms of being the least corrupt. Big question two, What are the normative models for bureaucracy, and how does one choose among them? Well, this has been one of my favorite topics for a long time because, in fact, I think the dominant normative model of bureaucracy that we find in most countries is not the one that I personally would favor. Here's 3 broad concepts of bureaucratic effectiveness. They all have strengths and weaknesses. The first I'm calling cost-efficient bureaucracy. Secondly, neutral competence, or what we normally think of as Weberian bureaucracy. And then the third place we have public values bureaucracy, which, as you might expect, since I wrote a book called Public Values and Public Interest, I would think is a pretty good idea. First of all, let's talk a little bit about cost efficiency bureaucracy because, in fact, it's dominant almost everywhere. It's also dominant in most reform efforts. Cost-efficient bureaucracy is focused on developing satisfactory levels of service at the least possible price. Now, there's different kinds of incarnations of cost-efficient bureaucracy. In the United States, it's primarily focused on market failure and the idea that anything that the market can do, it should do. But there are also just sort of cost containment issues in this concept of bureaucracy. So cost efficiency focuses of bureaucracy appeal to a number of groups. First of all, there's citizens or public officials that genuinely believe that the best government is the least possible government, and of course they naturally embrace cost efficiency and effectiveness. In the United States, that goes back to our roots. Thomas Jefferson is famous for arguing that the best government is the one that is the least possible government. And I would say probably in the United States, if you ask most people about their view of bureaucracy, their idea would be that it should be cost efficient. The idea also appeals to those people who have no normative or positive role for government, no value for government, except as a residual form of action when markets have failed. And people with that view are quite common in every political party, every political faction, and have been common throughout the history of the United States. And in fact, most countries I know anything about, there's a very significant percentage of the citizens and the politicians who basically view that the role of government is as a residual. Government should march in and be active when, in fact, there's no other choice in the marketplace. And it's easy enough to see why people would warm up to that idea, and particularly in places that are working very hard to develop stronger and competitive markets. So the cost efficiency approach to bureaucracy also is very much part and parcel of the new public management reforms. So later I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the concepts in new public management that have been embraced throughout the world, particularly in Europe and Australia and even more so in New Zealand, maybe in the United States. But and a lot of the reforms that are offered by various UN and World Bank and AID types of organizations are very much new public management focused. So this would be an example of some of the ideas of the new public management. I won't go over all of these, but I'm sure some of them are quite familiar to you in any case. But a lot of it has to do with marketization, privatization, working as much as possible through private sector contracts. So the role of government in many instances through new public management becomes contract manager. The idea behind the new public management is to have greater competition, and the idea is that the government also will work more effectively through managed competition and through competing with the private sector. And so there's very much of a stress on market discipline, on cutting direct costs. There's not as much of a focus on infrastructure that's going to be provided by other people. And there's a shift in values away from equity security, and really much more of a focus on efficiency and individualism. And so new public management for years was sweeping the world, and it was, in some ways, a sort of a clarification of an old paradigm of bureaucracy and government, but to some extent it was old wine in new bottles. And I've been asked many times, especially when I'm in Europe, why isn't it that we don't have a lot of discussions of the new public management in the United States? And it's really true. And in one sense, we came to that set of issues very late. And the answer is, I always give the same answer, which is, well, we've always been doing the new public management. It's not new. It's new to you. It might be new in New Zealand. It might be new in the UK, in the United States. That's just the way we've run government for many years. So that's why we didn't really embrace the term that much. So the classic type of bureaucracy, of course, and there's not as much of a normative-laden idea of bureaucracy in this, is a neutral competence or Weberian bureaucracy. And most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Weberian archetype, the idea that bureaucracy should be focused on rationalization and division of labor, functional jurisdictions. There should be a hierarchy of authority. Hiring and promotion should be based on technical competence, not whom you know. There should be a separation of administration and ownership. And maybe in some ways the most important contribution, management should be based on rules, written records, regulations that are transparent, rather than the whims of whoever happens to be in charge. So in the United States and many other places, Weberian bureaucracy has a kind of a bad name. Well, not kind of a bad name, it does. Basically, it's come to be synonymous with having sort of highly structured, overly controlling bureaucracy. But in fact, if you look at Weber's early work on bureaucracy and what he was comparing it to, which was essentially feudalism, then you can see that Weberian bureaucracy was quite a social invention. However, in the case of Weberian bureaucracy, the role of the bureaucrat is fairly limited. It's to faithfully, efficiently, competently execute the ideas and the dictates of the legitimate political superiors. So the idea of an activist bureaucracy is quite inconsistent with Weberian bureaucracy. One could argue that Weberian bureaucracy is an excellent first stage of development conception of bureaucracy. Most nations that do not have very well developed bureaucracies have significant governance challenges, have high levels of corruption, have not developed a Weberian bureaucracy. So those people who think that Weberian bureaucracy is really kind of a bad thing, well, it can be worse. There's many instances of all over the world where we might call them pre-Weberian bureaucracies are rife with corruption, are still based on political patrimony, and have very little to do with the rule of law. So Weberian bureaucracy is a necessary first step. So let's turn to big question 3, which is the one that I'm the most interested in, is what could we do to take a step beyond just cost efficiency bureaucracy, just Weberian bureaucracy, and have a bureaucracy that does a better job of serving public values rather than economic values or privatization values. How could that be achieved? Well, as I said, I've got ideas about this, and I'm biased because I spent a lot of time working on a book called Public Values and Public Interest. And what I'm talking about today is going to be somewhat related to that book, but also goes beyond it as well. And the idea behind the book is that there's a constant clash in governance between what we might call public interest or public values on the one hand, and private values and economic interest on the other hand, that there's a clash between markets and social goods. And in fact, to some extent, the book has been translated as anti-economics, and it's absolutely not anti-economics. Basically, I have nothing against economic individualism. The message of the book is very simple. The message is that private values and economic individualism are not enough. It's a good place to start, but efficiency is not enough. That's a good place to start. So, what I'm more interested in is effective bureaucracy, efficient bureaucracy, and yes, we can say it, good bureaucracy. Because I guess I've already given away my idea that I am one of those people that thinks that government and bureaucracy can be a positive force for social change and for achieving social goals. Well, it is, I think, demonstrably, and I think we can embrace it, improve it, and make it more of a force, a positive force for social change. In his essay on governance, Fukuyama asks this question: is a bureaucracy effective if it carries out with it a great efficiency, if it carries out the dictates of officialdom, even when those policies that it carries out are socially toxic? If we take the idea of a Bavarian bureaucracy, of the good bureaucrat executing the policies of the elected official sort of uncompromisingly, what do we do if, in fact, the policy itself is corrupt? Weberian impartiality is not enough, according to Fukuyama and Bozeman. This is a quote from Fukuyama. One would have to say that a concentration camp guard who executed everyone he was ordered to kill was more impartial than one who played favorites or spared certain individuals in return for bribes or sexual favors, or he might go on and say, just out of goodwill. That would probably meet the characteristics of a Weberian bureaucrat, but it would not meet the characteristics of a public servant. So impartiality in governance is vital. Neutral competence is vital. And governments are not going to work well if those values aren't achieved. But at the same time, they're not enough for a good government. And I'm using good government in a very special way. What I mean by good government is not what all reformers mean by good government. What I mean by government is a government doing good as specified through the public values that are elicited from the individuals working, or the individuals that are citizens of that state. So this would give you a comparison of the new public management, which I think probably, I would say, is the dominant mode of governance in many places in the world, including the United States, with an approach to governance that is more public values-based. And I'll focus a little bit more on the public values here, since, in fact, most of you are probably quite familiar with the new public management values. The public values-based approach to bureaucracy and government requires a shift from just input and output productivity to questions about outcomes and distributional equity. Distributional equity typically does not play much of a role in any sort of economics-approached, market failure-approached kind of governance strategy. As we know, it's become much more prominent in public discussions in all countries now, particularly as Gini indexes are showing us that social equity is a goal that's not being achieved in very many places. It's becoming more of a concern, but it still hasn't been embraced by specific government policies to any great extent. And public value focuses on bureaucracy. There's a shift toward capacity-based, outcomes-tested performance indicators, not cost efficiency indicators, not indicators that are primarily focused on measuring unit of production. That type of evaluation is more difficult, of course, but at the same time, it's more important to help us understand the role of values and social outcomes. And as I mentioned before, in the new public management, there's very much of a focus on privatization. There's very much of a focus on contracting. There's not as much of a focus on the problem that you cannot assume that you have government managers who are excellent contract managers. But in public values management, then there's more of a concern with using contracts as residual, not as a dominant mode of governance, that what they should do is supplement the capacity of government infrastructure rather than undermine the capacity of government infrastructure. I've witnessed this again and again in the United States as we've had various fashions toward privatization and more of a focus on government contracting. And what happens is that in the agencies that I've worked with, particularly in transportation and energy, the expertise that are kind of the hallmark of a Weberian bureaucracy migrates into the private sector, leaving people in the government who are not even able to manage the contracts that they are now imbued with as a result of the increased privatization of work. Under public values management, there is a more of a neutrality on sector management, on ownership. There's not any kind of privileging of the private sector. There is a sort of a hard and fast pragmatism. Under public values management, you worry less about economic theory, our public interest theory, and more about who can get the job done well. And sometimes the answers are not completely obvious. Sometimes it's not all about gleaning the blessings of competitiveness of the private economy. I'll give you an example. In working with the Department of Energy, this is a little technical, I'll make it a short story. But when I was working with the Department of Energy, I was an advisor for them with regard to the privatization of the national laboratories in the United States, because there were people in Congress who believed that if we could only get private sector organizations to compete on managing the national federal laboratories, everything would work well. They were working on theory. I was working on pragmatism. And in fact, if what you're interested in doing is encouraging efficiency or effectiveness through market structures, there has to be a supply and a demand side. That's you don't have to know a lot about economics to know that. What the Department of Energy was doing was first having no bidders in many cases for these massive contracts because they involved indemnification of all kinds of natural hazards, and companies weren't interested in it. So the really ironic part was that the so-called efficiency of contracting for the national laboratories really meant that the United States had to pay them to manage the laboratories that the government was already managing. So it wasn't a real contract. It was basically a legal and official bribe. If you will do this, then we will pay you an extra supplement because we know that nobody in their right mind would want to bid for this contract and manage what government managers have been managing fairly well for decades. So that and other experiences leads me to be completely skeptical about whether government should be performing a task or whether the private sector should be performing a task, because it depends on so many factors and so many variables related to the market structure, the level of capacity in government, the technical skills in government, and not least the ability of people in government to manage the contracts that they've let. So when someone has a sort of an ideological, theoretical notion that privatization is always good or always bad, send them to me. I'd like to argue with them. My experience has not been like that at all. I was also the head of the Atlanta Water Privatization Commission, which sounds like a small thing. It was actually the largest public works contract at the time in the world for water. And in fact, we argued against the privatization for many of the same kinds of reasons. It was accomplished. It was one of the great engineering firms in the world was hired to deliver it. The contract lasted two years, and one of the results was the contract was that in an effort to cut costs, the fire hydrants hadn't been replaced, and a large public housing complex burned to the ground because of efficiency needs. Well, sometimes efficiency is not the most important thing, particularly if you happen to have your own house on fire. Then what you would like to have is effectiveness more than efficiency. And then finally, if we talk about a public values-focused bureaucracy, what we were concerned about is a value shift toward equity, community, and a pragmatically determined public interest. So one might ask, if in fact one is interested in pursuing a public values-based bureaucracy, how does one even know what are the public values? Well, Well, that's not a bad question. We do know that there's a great deal of difference among people about what are the core public values. But here are some of the ways that we can know about public values. In most democratic nations, there's core values that are in founding documents, that are in the most fundamental laws, and they can be, to a large extent, assumed to represent a covenant among the people. In other cases, it's possible to simply identify public values through collective action. In the small cases, you can deal with public values through such things as town hall meetings, through plebiscites, and so forth. That's very clear. In some cases, as a first step, one of the best ways to deal with identifying public values and how to manage them is simply to look at the government documents and their goals, their highest goals, their mission goals. Now, it is true that if your government is illegitimate or corrupt, then that wouldn't be a good place to start. But in most cases, frankly, even illegitimate, corrupt governments are still going to have glowing kinds of goal statements and mission statements. And so that's also a good place to start, and that leads to another personal anecdote. And let me tell you what you can achieve just by doing that. So this is a little technical, but I'll tell it anyway because I think it does show that you can elicit public values and you can measure them. So I was doing work on public values related to the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And the National Institutes of Health has this wonderful compendium that they produce every few years called Healthy People. And so there's Healthy People 2010, Healthy People 2014, and they produce it, and it's a very elaborate, well-articulated set of goals they want to achieve. So, and they're not all high-level goals. So some of them will be things like reduce respiratory illness from pollution by 25%, reduce the disparity in the rate of black and white women's breast cancer by 15%. And so it gets down at a reasonably low level so that you can actually figure out what it is that people are trying to achieve. And they develop these values by consensus among people working at the National Institutes of Health and also meeting with citizens all around the United States. So basically the way to think about it is you've got this one book that tells you what the public values are for health and medical research in the United States. So what we thought we would do would be to test the attainment of the public values. So one thing that's very nice about the National Institutes of Health, they support research. That's the main thing they do. And for all of the research they do, the researchers do abstracts. What we did was take all of the abstracts, thousands of them, and allocate them according to the goals. And we did this with people who were biomedical researchers and experts and who could read the abstract and say, well, this fits there. And what we found was that we had this beautiful document on public values that was not being served at all. In fact, what was happening was there were some matrices, cells in the matrix of goals that were completely unoccupied. So, for example, there was almost no work on environmental effects on cancer and research on that. And there were other cells, like, for example, genetic precursors to cancer, that there were so many dots in the matrix that it was solid. The finding saying that we had the set of public values, it was an agreed on consensual public values, and there was no follow-through or commitment in the bureaucracy to allocate the funding to the public values that it itself had embraced. So it is possible to identify public values, or at least distill them. It is possible to measure them. It is possible to look at their effects on outcomes. It can be done. It's much easier to talk about cost efficiency. It's much easier to talk about a unit of production costs this amount. But that's not really what we're trying to achieve. If what you have is a medical care system that is highly cost efficient, except for the minor fact that people are dying at an alarming rate, that's the highest in the world, cost efficiency actually doesn't do that much for you. That could be much the same could be said of almost every public value that is achieved in any attempt at governance, and that is that the ultimate goal is not about being efficient. It's about being effective, where effective is defined as having a positive social impact. So, what is the key to a public value-based bureaucracy? How do we achieve that? In my judgment, the way that you achieve a public values-based bureaucracy is by having bureaucrats who are committed to it. So again, this may be a cynical, biased view from the United States and our cynical politics, where we have actors as presidents and hotel moguls maybe as presidents. So maybe I'm cynical about this, but I will say this, that politicians come and go. There's often sweeping changes because politicians come and go. I'm not diminishing its importance, but if you want to achieve stable change, then the place for that, the place for the stability is potentially in the bureaucracy, a public value bureaucracy. And the key to a public value bureaucracy is professionalization and an autonomous public service. And in the United States, we actually have that as, in my judgment, one of our greatest strengths. For all of the kinds of political theater that we have, if you look at the people who get things done that are not publicized in the news, it is a professional bureaucracy, and there are three public policies that are especially important in understanding how the professional bureaucracy in the United States was developed. One was the Pendleton Act, which created a civil service commission that was focused on merit basis of appointment. Before that, merit actually had very little to do with appointment. There's problems with the Civil Service Commission, there's problems with civil service tests, but in fact, it's a lot better way to get your job than because your brother-in-law knows somebody. In 1939, the Hatch Act was produced, which prohibited political activities of most federal government employees. Before that time, it was possible for your boss to put pressure on you to vote for a particular candidate or donate money, and in fact, that can undermine a professional autonomous bureaucracy about as quickly as anything. In 1978, the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 was produced, in part, I might add, by my former dean at the Maxwell School, Scotty Campbell. He was moved over to become head of the Office of Personnel Management. And this created something called the Senior Executive Service. And the idea behind this was that there would be a large cadre of highly professionalized, skilled managers who would be compensated fairly, who were also portable, who could be moved from one agency to the other because they were prized for their high-level management skills, their strategic instincts and abilities, and their commitment to public value. All of these things, I think, have played a role in strengthening bureaucracy, even as politicians continue to bash the bureaucracy as being a major problem that we have in the United States. But the U.S. is not Latin America. I understand that, and of course, I wish I could speak a lot more about Latin America. And the truth of the matter is I have a lot of numbers about Latin America, like these numbers. But the truth of the matter is I don't have a good contextual feel, never having lived here and never having worked in an extensive way in any Latin American country, just some minor consulting activities. So I can't make judgments about the natures of your specific bureaucracies in specific places. I don't know about the level of professionalization of bureaucrats in Uruguay versus Brazil versus Argentina. That's not known to me, but hopefully that will come up in the question period. I can say this, there is a social infrastructure that is required for public values and governance, and I do know this much about Latin America, and that is that the nations here some nations are relatively homogeneous, other nations are great melting pots with many races and many ethnicities. I do know that some of the countries in Latin America have very rigid class structures. Some of them are more open. So I know there's a lot of variety here. But it seems to me that we have the following preconditions in every case for developing an autonomous bureaucracy, especially one that is going to be focused strongly and effectively on realizing public values and the public interest. And these are some of these preconditions. First of all, legitimate, stable elections. It's very difficult to accomplish much of anything in bureaucratic effectiveness or governance effectiveness absent legitimate, stable elections, which of course we've had throughout most of Latin America and most of our hemisphere for a long time now. Limited civil violence. Again, it's very difficult for bureaucracies to thrive when there's huge amounts of civil unrest and social upheaval in a country. This is probably about as important as anything, a political culture with a belief in civic virtue, and that is the idea that people have obligations to other people. They have a sort of a social contract with their government, and their government has a social contract with them, and their part of the social contract is paid by being part of the attentive public, being politically active, voting, taking public issues seriously, and that, as much as anything, can support an autonomous, effective bureaucracy. A sense of social cohesion and community is vital. One of the reasons that's especially interesting to me, as I told you before, that I've been a long-time student comparing Denmark and the United States, one where there is a great sense of community and social cohesion, and one in which there isn't. And it's going to be interesting to watch what happens to Scandinavian countries now that they're becoming more heterogeneous. There's more immigrants. One alarming statistic I saw was that there's a great rise in the Finnish and Swedish Nazi parties, due mainly to changes in immigration. So the sense of cohesion and community, and we're all in this game together, may be breaking down there. Let's hope not. In the United States, we've always had to work very hard to try to achieve any sense of cohesion and community. And now we're going through a very, very bad time, which I'm hoping we will get through, with draconian policies about immigration, or at least draconian rhetoric about immigration, in some cases real actions. But politicians are making their fame and fortune based on who can be the most intolerant of immigrants. So what effect will that have on our ability to have effective bureaucracy? That's something most people aren't even considering. But in fact, I think it's important, because what it says is that we have people competing with one another rather than a sense of community and people actually complementing one another. Something of that sort can be toxic to healthy bureaucracy in the United States or anywhere else. That's all I have to say, but I'm really looking forward to your questions, and thank you very much.
Agradecemos enormemente la presentación del profesor Boseman. Ha sido rigurosa, exhaustiva y sugiere una serie seguramente de interrogantes y comentarios, de modo que tienen ustedes la palabra. Ahí, por favor. Los colegas del micrófono.
Hola, hola. Thank you.
Vamos a acumular unas 3 o 4 preguntas para contestarlas en bloques, más eficiente. Adelante.
Dr. Boseman, my name is Patricio Aranda from the National Authority on Civil Service. I would like to ask, how can public servants could act and think beyond political parties? In other words, is it possible that without diminishing public values and citizen status, bureaucracy could achieve a level of non-partisan behaviors? Well, did the Hatch Act have and still is ineffective? Thank you.
Bien, gracias. Por favor.
Thank you for Mr. Boseman. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it will be a pleasure also to be with you in some works in Latin American countries. Una pregunta, simplemente, considerando que el problema de los valores está en la esencia del comportamiento humano, que incluso hay autores que se han dedicado un poco más a ese concepto. Nosotros podríamos decir que hay valores universales que están grabados en el ser esencial y que en eso se debe basar, se debe fundamentar el Estado, o podríamos considerar que las idiosincrasias aún generan diferencias. En ese caso, se vería una diferencia de idiosincrasias latinoamericanas con otras partes del mundo.
Gracias. ¿Alguien más? Ahí, por favor.
Good morning. My name is Mila Gasco. I come from the Institute of Public Governance and Management at ESADE Business School, Barcelona, Spain. Thank you very much for your lecture. I come from Europe, and we talk about the traditional public bureaucracy, the new public management, but lately we are embracing new public governance. Many scholars in Europe are talking about this new trend, many of them led by Stephen Osborne, who you might know. And my question is, are there any relationships between this public-focused, public value-focused bureaucracy and our new public governance bureaucracy? I identified some commonalities, for example, this focus on outcomes, but I would like to know your opinion about these different ways of naming things. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Una última pregunta.
Profesor Boseman, muy buenos días. Mi nombre es Sergio Chica, vengo de la Escuela Superior de Administración Pública, ESAP de Colombia. Mi pregunta en concreto es, ¿qué papel juega la confianza en esta perspectiva de valor público? Y si nos podría hablar al respecto de la nueva visión de la posnueva gestión pública y cómo esas nuevas visiones de la posnueva gestión pública pueden transformar las orientaciones frente a la nueva gestión pública en la perspectiva latinoamericana. Gracias.
Bien, vamos a pedir entonces al profesor Boseman que conteste estas cuatro preguntas formuladas y si hay tiempo seguimos con más. Go ahead. Oh, yeah.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I will just take them in order rather than trying to figure out any sort of natural order. First of all, regarding the question about diminishing public values and nonpartisan values, and particularly related to the Hatch Act and effects, or whether that's possible, I'll give you my impression about the United States, but also about the European countries that I've worked with, and also Japan. Those are places I know about, and Taiwan. And I don't think that there is anything inimical about having public values, having individual private values, and at the same time being nonpartisan. I think that's actually accomplished relatively well in most of the countries that I work with closely. And it's taken a long time, but in fact, it doesn't seem to be a big problem. Now, in the United States, we actually can prosecute people for violations of the Hatch Act or various civil service reform acts, but we don't even have cases because I think it's just been inculcated. The idea being that you can have your own opinions. They might be outrageous. They may be a minority. You're entitled to them. You just don't bring them to work with you. And I think over time that's just been kind of an assumption that people go to work with and take for granted, and it hasn't been that big of a deal for the most part. And I also don't think it really diminishes public values because people can easily, if they're sort of working as bureaucrats that are seeking to be neutral, they can easily, in some cases, participate in a very rich public values life while at the same time not being partisan. The question about values being the essence of human behavior and universal values, I think probably there are some universal values. At least there's ones that we can pretty easily agree on. One of the sets of values that I've studied because half of my work is in science policy, is in the Belmont Code. The Belmont Code is a world code that was developed in the wake of Nuremberg and Nazi Germany and medical experiments. And the Belmont Code was an idea to enforce standards on the entire world about activities related to scientific research and medical research. And it was not that difficult for people to agree on some of the most basic kinds of values. Respect for human life, respect for vulnerable populations, and that's been embraced and embodied in every what we call institutional review board for research all around the world. And so I do think we can recognize some, but at the same time, it is very true, and I think it's fine and should be fine, that there's going to be considerable differences in public values in different countries. So I keep mentioning Denmark, but I work in Denmark. I lived in Denmark, and so my colleague, the late Professor Torben Bech Jorgensen, and I did comparative studies for years of public values in Denmark and the United States, and they were completely different. That's okay. You know, the nations were founded on different concepts, and so the real issue is making sure that those public values do not become hostages to tyranny or to political forces that are beyond the control of the people. It's not a matter that they have to agree from one nation to the next. There's a rich diversity of nations and political cultures, and public values embraces that. I think I will sort of combine the questions about the new public management and new public management governance, since they were to some extent related. My colleague from Spain and my colleague from Colombia. I actually have not worked in Colombia. I do a lot of work in Spain, so I know a little bit about that. And I also do know Steve Osborne and some of the people who are involved in that movement. And what I would say is that the way that the new public management has been evolving, and this is just my personal opinion, is much more positive. That it has been taking into account a wider array of factors than technical market efficiency. And I think probably the movement toward what I call public values management and new public management has been increasing. And in fact, they're not really that far away. Remember, when we talk about public values management, there's nothing in it that says that we shouldn't use markets. It's just that markets are an instrument, just like government. It's not an instrument, and neither one should be privileged. We should look and see which is effective and why. I think probably new public management has not completely embraced that idea yet. Regarding the role of confidence and vision in new public management, and whether that can change approaches to public administration in Latin America, honestly, I think it can. So I do think that the new public management would be considered an appropriate and useful set of reforms in many places in Latin America. And in some ways, I think it could be very positive, which may seem a little odd since I was contrasting it to an approach that I like even better, which is public values management. But the new public management brings a certain discipline and systematic approach to governance that sometimes can be very beneficial in making progress. Thank you.
Bien, tenemos unos 15 minutos adicionales, de modo que si alguien quiere intervenir haciendo un comentario, una pregunta, una reflexión, tiene la posibilidad de hacerlo. Por favor.
Good morning, Dr. Bozeman. A question. I'm a Peruvian. Supposing that we have a bureaucracy with public values, it seems like in countries like Latin American countries, it's not enough. We need an objective of results. We need an objective of trying to surpass the rigidities and the very complicated laws that have to do with management, with public management. For example, in Peru we have 12 administrative systems that are very complicated. And so it's not only an issue of having a good public value-oriented civil servant, but also it has to do with the software of the state that is obsolete, and that could be even a greater challenge than having a public value servant bureaucracy. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes, actually I agree with you completely about that. And I don't pretend to know very much about, I don't know anything about Peru except what I've learned in about 48 hours. Okay, I understand that. But I agree with you completely that public values management, I certainly wouldn't call it a luxury. It's not that. It's something that I think we have a right to expect, but it's not enough. You remember I said, as I was talking, that you could think of Weberian bureaucracy as a kind of a first stage of effectiveness that could move into a second stage of effectiveness, which could be public values outcomes. But public values cannot be realized if, in fact, you do not have an effective Weberian efficient bureaucracy. Because then what you have is a set of nice goals and people with good incentives and motives in their heart. And you know, when you're working with 12 different administrative systems that are incompatible, it doesn't make any difference. So much of my work in public administration has been on bureaucratic pathology and red tape. So I feel your pain. There's been 3 books written on red tape. I wrote 2 of them. You know, so I really respect how difficult it is to get things done efficiently in public and private bureaucracies, and how it's natural to overlay one system on top of another system and never clean anything out, and how there's political stakes in all of these. And so this has been a lifelong interest of mine. But yes, that's step 1. We have to get that right, and then we can move to step 2 and make sure that our bureaucracies are not just functioning, but that they're also functioning to achieve the public values that we all wish. Let me just contradict just one thing, even though I agree with you on almost everything. The public values is very much results-focused. It's just that it's a result that's farther down the chain. So it's very focused on social outcome results, but if you do not have even minimal kinds of efficiency results and technical results as a precursor, then you're not going to achieve the downstream results either.
¿Alguna intervención adicional? Pregunto. Por favor. Si alguien nos alcanza un micrófono, primera fila.
Muy buenos días. La verdad que quisiera hacer un comentario y una pregunta. Mi nombre es Francisco Ganga, soy de Chile. Y básicamente tiene que ver con consultarle a nuestro brillante expositor respecto de qué podemos hacer los países latinoamericanos para poder instalar una verdadera cultura de la meritocracia. Se lo comento porque, en general, los tomadores de decisión hablan mucho de la meritocracia y de este traspaso, ¿cierto?, de la definición de cargos estratégicos al interior del gobierno o del Estado, y nos prometen, sobre todo cuando hay campañas, de que el próximo gobierno sí va a estar administrado por los mejores. Pero cuando llega el momento de las definiciones, uno se encuentra que muchos de los personeros públicos, con suerte, logran distinguir la diferencia entre Estado y gobierno y llegan a hacer verdaderas prácticas al Estado o a los gobiernos. En esos contextos y en esos escenarios, evidentemente que es muy difícil que nuestros países avancen, porque cuando las personas empiezan a conocer la lógica, las perspectivas, la forma como funciona el Estado, lamentablemente ya tienen que irse. Muchas gracias.
Okay, those are very good points. They're not unique to Latin America. We have the same kind of problem too, which is that people campaign and campaign about good government, and then the next regime comes in, they campaign about good government. Right now in the United States, we have a series of debates going on with presidential candidates, and one of our leading Republican candidates, a woman by the name of Carly Fiorina, who was a chief executive officer in a major computer firm, is now proposing a new approach to effective government, which is zero-based budgeting. I had to laugh when I heard that because she's proposing that as a reform. It was actually a reform in the 1940s, and then it was a reform again, the same reform in the 1970s, and now it's going to be a reform if she's elected. So there was a really nice book written by a colleague of mine at NYU, Paul Light, who wrote a book called The Tides of Reform and documents these kinds of changes in an ebb and flow when nothing much of consequence changes. So, but that's a little bit different than how you would approach the idea of building a competent, merit-based bureaucracy and a culture that supports it. Because, I mean, I hate to say this, but my experience is that even in countries that do have a competent, merit-based bureaucracy, they also have political critics eternally. So that just comes with the territory. But what I would say that I would, what you might want to consider in Chile, and actually I do know a little bit about Chile because I've worked with the government there on science indicators and evaluation. But what I would say is look at the historical case study of the Taiwanese government. I visited Taiwan several times, and they have one of the strongest civil service organizations you'd want to see. And the reason they do is because they have made it a high public priority and they followed through with it. It's actually a cabinet department, you know. So in the United States we have Department of Defense, the Department of Health, Education, Welfare, what we used to call it. We have Department of Transportation. We don't have a Department of Civil Service, but they do in Taiwan. And basically everybody recognizes that the Taiwanese Civil Service Department is a central piece of government, and they support it and take pride in it. The same things are true in Japan. And so I think part of it is just recognizing that this is not something that needs to be buried down in the bowels of governance. It needs to be front and center, that it's the type of organization, the type of activity that will allow everyone else to achieve their specific goals in energy or transportation or science or medicine or whatever, and without it, it's very hard to do that. How you would achieve that, I'm not entirely sure, but I would at least do some historical case studies of some places that have done it very well.
Bien, una última intervención. No veo mano. Sí, la última, por favor.
Hélio Teixeira, do Brasil. É uma pergunta e um breve comentário. É como prosseguir fortalecendo as bases da democracia, duas grandes bases, impessoalidade e formalidade, diante de um mundo cada vez mais complexo, em que formalidade levada a rigor...
Ok, no tenemos prevista la traducción del portugués al inglés, de modo que si nos haces el favor de hacerlo en portuñol, tal vez las colegas de la cabina nos pueden ayudar, o directamente en inglés, por favor.
The problem is the question of formality and the complexity of the world. The rules like Obama, the Plan Obama of Health, or Sarbanes-Oxley, many, many pages. It's difficult to practice formality. And we need new entrepreneurs. And there is a shock with this kind of necessity. And the rules that don't permit the exercise of initiative and so on. And it's difficult to practice the good basis of bureaucracy in the new world, in the new complexity.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Those are very good points. There are several different issues embedded in those points, however, and some of them I think I would agree with, some of them not so much. So it is true that it's very, very difficult to achieve most public purposes when we're strangled by rules and regulations. Then the question becomes, why are we strangled by rules and regulations? So you mentioned the Obamacare issue, and I can tell you, in my judgment, why we're strangled with rules and regulations there. It's not because we have government bureaucrats that are malevolent and trying to make sure that our government doesn't work. What happened is we have a campaign finance system whereby the insurance companies and the medical providers and the pharmaceutical providers pay lots of money to people in congressional elections, and guess what? Their exceptions get written into the rules. And so the whole Obamacare idea started with the assumption that the insurance companies in the United States would be protected and there would not be a one-payer system. Started there. That immediately meant that you keep growing the rules and regulations. So in that particular case, the key to effective governance is political. It isn't bureaucratic. And the sources of being undermined are political, not bureaucratic. As one who studied organizational red tape for decades and measured organizational red tape literally around the world, I can tell you that a very modest part of it is caused by bureaucratic agencies. It doesn't mean it never happens, and it can be improved, but some of the studies I've done where agencies came in and helped me, tried to get me to say, how can you help with the red tape? Honestly, they weren't doing anything wrong. But what happens is sometimes the political regime just increasingly puts rules, stipulations, outs, different kinds of sort of political payoffs for contributors, and so again and again the rules accrete, become larger, and there's almost no capacity to get rid of them. Now, in my book, which don't want to plug two books at the same time, but I will say this. We did come up with a series of prescriptions of things that agencies could actually do, like sunset laws on rules and regulations, red tape audits, which I've actually performed for organizations. I also went to Italy and did a red tape audit. That was an interesting story. They had so much red tape that actually never got paid for the consulting work because they couldn't find a way to do it because of the red tape. But yeah, it's not an impenetrable problem, but it's one that's fascinating. And the last thing I'll say is about entrepreneurship. Absolutely, red tape gets in the way of entrepreneurship, small business. That's also something that's fixed relatively easily, at least for small business. And a lot of places in the United States have what they call one-stop shopping approaches, so that you can go one place, get all of your rules and regulations taken care of, your licenses taken care of. It's possible to actually expedite these things. And it's also important to remember that rules and regulations in some cases protect entrepreneurs by leveling the playing field. So we did some work on environmental rules and regulations, and sometimes the primary client for the regulations were other businesses because they wanted a regulatory playing field where everything was fair for different competitors. So it's very complex, but I do think there are some complex solutions that can actually be the rules and regulations part can conceivably be resolved if there is the will and there is the ability and commitment to do something about it. But it's not easy.
Bien, yo diría que hemos agotado con creces y productivamente la sesión, la última de las plenarias, y hemos completado un brillante ciclo de las 3 conferencias previstas para este Congreso. Vamos a reiterar nuestro agradecimiento a la presentación del profesor Boozman con un aplauso cerrado.
Thank you for those great questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Y vamos a convocarlos para el próximo año a ver qué sorpresas les tenemos en materia de conferencistas. Muchas gracias por su asistencia.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.